The USSR anti-religious campaign was a campaign of anti-religious persecution against churches and believers by the Soviet government following the initial anti-religious campaign during the Russian Civil War. The elimination of all religion and its replacement with atheism supported with a materialist worldview was a fundamental ideological goal of the state. To this end, the state conducted anti-religious persecutions against believers that were meant to hurt and destroy religion. It was never made illegal to be a believer or to have religion, and so the activities of this campaign were often veiled under other pretexts that the state invoked or invented in order to justify its activities. History. The persecution entered a new phase in 1921 with the resolutions adopted by the 10th CPSU Congress, and would set the atmosphere for the remainder of the decade's persecutions, which would enter another new phase in 1929 when new legislation was passed on prohibition of public religious activities. The 10th Party Congress launched Lenin's new economic policy, in response to the poor state of the Russian economy that resulted from World War I, the Russian Civil War, and the war communist system used during the latter. The state faced large-scale popular revolts of workers, which Trotsky believed threatened the survival of the state. The net brought in some measure of limited free enterprise, and was meant to compromise with the general population as well as to present the new regime in a more respectable light to the world community and thus acquire a place in the world market. To acquire a better reputation, the regime considered it detrimental to continue with the Civil War policy of murdering religious believers without trials or plausible accusations. Therefore, the anti-religious campaign needed to be conducted under more respectable pretexts. However, the elimination of religion remained a fundamental ideological goal of the state. There were two main, principal anti-religious campaigns that occurred in the 1920s, with one surrounding the campaign to seize church valuables and the other surrounding the renovationist schism in the Orthodox Church. This portion of the state's religious campaign came to an end in 1929, when Stalin began the implementation of a much harsher campaign that would take place in the following decade. Legislative measures. The 10th Party Congress met in early 1921 and issued the resolution on Glavpolitprosvet and the agitation, propaganda problems of the party. This resolution called for wide-scale organization, leadership, and cooperation in the task of anti-religious agitation and propaganda among the broad masses of the workers, using the mass media, films, books, lectures, and other devices. In August of that year, a plenary meeting of the Party Central Committee adopted an 11-point instruction on the interpretation and application of Article 13. The instruction made a differentiation between educated believers and uneducated believers, and it forbade party membership to any religious believer who was a member of the clergy or who had an education. But uneducated believers were allowed party membership on an individual basis if they proved their devotion to communism. It was decreed that such members, however, should be submitted to special re-education work in order to make them atheists. The instruction warned against rash actions in anti-religious propaganda, against giving too much publicity to anti-religious agitation, and it stressed serious scientific cultural enlightenment work, building up natural scientific foundation for a proper historical analysis of the question of religion. This meant that the anti-religious campaign was to be directed at building up a non-religious culture and educational system, rather than subjecting religion to ridicule and attack. It directed the Central Committee, Agitation Department, Revolution and the Church in Glavpolitprosvet to conform to this. The instruction also emphasized that the state was fighting against all forms of religious belief and not simply individual religions. It was after the 10th Congress that the authorities began to take measures against the public debates, which were eventually formally suspended in 1929 and replaced with public lectures by atheists. The reason given for their cessation was that they did not satisfy public demand and that people preferred to solidify their atheism with study. Martin Kofsky was arrested and sent to exile in 1922 on account of his religious preaching that attracted people to religion, and told he could return in a few years once the workers had become wiser. Persecution against the Orthodox Church. Despite the part of the August 1921 instruction about combating all religions, the state took a particular hard line against the Orthodox Church on the pretext that it was a legacy of the Tsarist past. This may also have been a pragmatic consideration in the belief that the state was not yet strong enough in order to broaden its anti-religious activities beyond the Orthodox Church. When church leaders demanded freedom of religion under the constitution, the communists responded with terror. They murdered the Metropolitan of Kiev and executed 28 bishops and 6,775 priests. Despite mass demonstrations in support of the church, repression cowed most ecclesiastical leaders into submission. Tikhon produced an encyclical on political neutrality and disengagement of the church from worldly politics, and the official propaganda depicted it as a form of camouflage to hide his real aim of support for autocratic bourgeois aristocracy. Tikhon emphasized the freedom of the church in the separation of church and state and the duty of believers to be loyal to the state in civic matters, inasmuch as this did not contradict a Christian's primary loyalty to God. He produced 3 declarations of loyalty to the Soviet state, in 1919, 1923 and in his last testament in 1925. Beginning in March 1922, the Soviet press published libelous accounts of the behavior of clergy and believers. This was followed up with arrests and trials of the people attacked. Believers could also be arrested in association with claiming or honoring miracles. Miracles needed to be suppressed in the eyes of the state due to their contradiction of the atheism of the official state ideology. However, it was not yet legal to prosecute people simply for making such claims, so the miracle claims were prosecuted instead under the pretext that they were acts of resistance meant to strengthen believers in their resistance to hold on to church valuables. In Tula, the local bishop Juvenali was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment after the local populace claimed a miracle to have occurred. Several others were imprisoned along with him. The campaign to disprove miracles met considerable resistance from believers as well as many clashes and arrests. Faith had to be turned into a private affair and made as invisible as possible. The regime could not tolerate dynamic faith or popular religious leaders who could inspire and lead millions of people. To this effect, Lenin's doctrine that the state should be much more tolerant towards amoral or even criminal priests rather than those of good moral standing was interpreted such that popular clergymen were removed, imprisoned or killed wherever it was deemed feasible. Charges would often be invented against such popular clergy in order to justify their arrest, imprisonment or execution. This method was especially harsh in rural areas away from foreign observers, where a systematic campaign liquidated the most popular monks and shut down the most authoritative monasteries. Through this, the famous Optina monastery was shut down in 1922 and turned into a state museum, and one of the elders was arrested. All 7 local churches were shut down as well by 1929. The museum would later be closed in 1928, and by 1930 the monks who had served in it were mostly either in hiding or had been sent to concentration camps. Secret monasticism began to develop in the 1920s in response to the state persecution. This practice involved either people who lived in the world, who undertook monastic vows secretly and lived a double life with other secret monks or nuns, or it involved communities of monastics who lived in secret and isolated from society. When such communities were discovered, the monastics could sometimes be immediately executed. Future church leaders were in these communities, and they may have been instrumental in preserving monasticism in the USSR. Tikhon died in 1925. He was replaced in 1927 by Metropolitan Sergei, who gave unqualified loyalty to the state. The Church, however, continued to teach that orthodoxy was incompatible with Marxism. This was contrasted by many other religious groups in the country that tried to reaffirm how they were compatible with the state ideology when they were put under attack. The Patriarchal Church lost its ability to train new clergy in 1928 after its advanced theological studies in Leningrad voluntarily closed. Campaign to seize church valuables. The Volga Basin is subject to periodic droughts that can sometimes last for several years. The last famine that had been produced by this occurred in 1891, and after that experience the Tsarist government had built up special stockpiles of grain in preparation for a future famine. All of these stockpiles had been taken and used by armed factions in the Civil War, however, and new droughts in the Volga in 1920 to 1922 resulted in a massive famine. Patriarch Tikhon made an appeal to the world community and religious leaders outside of Russia for aid. The Church formed a famine relief committee, but this was shut down by the government only a few months after it had been created, and that they hand over all the money they had collected. Lenin ordered that all of the precious metals, precious stones and valuable material that could be found in religious buildings throughout the country should be confiscated and sold in order to create funds to help relieve the famine. The Patriarch appealed to the parishes on February 19, 1922 to surrender all such objects of value with the exception of the vessels used for the Holy Eucharist. On February 28, the government issued another order to all state agents to confiscate all sacred vessels including those used in the sacraments. On the same day, the Patriarch issued an encyclical asking believers to be very generous in the donations so as to pay off the cost of the vessels used in the Eucharist, but not to give up the vessels themselves. Lenin jumped at the opportunity and used it as a pretext to attack the Church. Lenin also refused the Patriarch's request that church representative be included in the government commissions inspecting, confiscating and account for the confiscated valuables. The Patriarch distrusted the government's intentions, and maintained his order not to hand over the vessels. The state went ahead and sent armed requisitioning teams around the country to collect the valuables, and they provoked much resistance. The sixth sector of the OGPU, led by Yevgeny Tujkov, began aggressively arresting and executing bishops, priests, and devout worshippers, such as Metropolitan Benyamin in Petrograd in 1922 for refusing to accede to the demand to hand in church valuables. Archbishop Andronik of Perm, who worked as a missionary in Japan, was shot after being forced to his own grave. Bishop Germagen of Tobolsk, who voluntarily accompanied the Tsar into exile, was strapped to the paddle wheel of a steamboat and mangled by the rotating blades. By mid-1922 there had been 14 violent clashes between the faithful and the armed detachments, as well as 55 trials and 231 group cases. Tikhon appeared as a witness to the trial of 54 clergy and he took personally responsibility for their actions upon himself. 12 of the 54 were executed and 27 received prison sentences. At least 35 Orthodox were legally sentenced to death in connection with this campaign. One of the bloodiest of the clashes occurred in an old textile industrial town called Shuya, near Moscow. On March 15, 1922, a group of mounted police arrived at the church square to requisition the valuables and a large crowd of believers had gathered there as well. The Soviet press reported that the mounted police were greeted with threatening shouts and hurling of rocks or other articles, while someone rang an alarm bell that brought huge masses of people to the square. There was then brought in an infantry half-company, supported by 2 armored cars with mounted machine guns. The Soviet press reported that believers fired the first shots with pistols at the soldiers, who then returned fire on the crowd. After the event, Lenin wrote that their enemies had foolishly afforded them a great opportunity by this action, since he believed that the peasant masses would not support the church's hold on its valuables in light of the famine, and that the resistance that the church offered could be met with bloody retaliation against the clergy without inciting popular sympathy for them. He wrote, "At the party congress arrange a secret meeting of all or almost all delegates to discuss this matter jointly with the chief workers of the GPU, the People's Commissariat of Justice (NKIU), and the Revolutionary Tribunal. At this meeting pass a secret resolution of the Congress that the removal of property of value, especially from the very richest lawyers, monasteries, and churches, must be carried out with ruthless resolution, leaving nothing in doubt, and in the very shortest time. The greater the number of representatives of the reactionary clergy and the reactionary bourgeoisie that we succeed in shooting on this occasion, the better, because this audience must precisely now be taught a lesson in such a way that they will not dare to think about any resistance whatsoever for several decades." In this same letter, which was secret at the time but now published, Lenin explained that the campaign to seize church valuables was meant not for primarily philanthropic reasons but rather as a means of provoking the church into a situation wherein it could be greatly attacked with little reprisal and depicted as a heartless organization that would not give up its goal to feed the starving poor. This fact may have also explained his shutting down of the church's famine relief efforts and his refusal to accept the compromise. It also likely affected the misrepresentation of the church's position in the Soviet press, wherein it was not acknowledged that the Patriarch had offered to arrange to pay for the valuables, and the church hierarchy was presented as careless about the catastrophe. Several trials and executions of clergy followed the Shuya incident. The campaign was not directed at only the Orthodox Church, but it also seized valuables present in religious buildings of other religions. Trials were conducted of Roman Catholics and Jews who resisted the seizure, but they generally received much milder sentences than the Orthodox. The valuables collected proved to be of pitiful value on the world market, but Lenin's propaganda effect was still achieved. With the conclusion of the campaign of seizing church valuables, the terror campaign against the church was called off for a while. In May 1923, the Anti-Religious Commission of the CPSU Central Committee ordered the GPU to investigate all closures of churches, should these have taken place with abuse of the Soviet legislation on the cults. The guilty ones ought to be made responsible for their acts. The commission addressed a letter to the Central Committee suggesting immediate discontinuation of the closure of churches, and the publication of an article in Pravda condemning such acts. The Central Committee followed with an internal letter to all party organizations on June 23, calling for a halt to all such abuses which cause all sorts of dissatisfaction, made use of by anti-Soviet elements. The physical attack was called off, but the propaganda war continued. The Soviet press after the campaign accused the clergy and laity of hiding or stealing church valuables. Even more arrests and imprisonments followed these accusations. This, however, was cut short by the failure of the state to conceal the embarrassing massive black market operations by Soviet officials who were caught stealing and selling the valuables for themselves. This news resulted in rioting by believers. In total, it is estimated that 8,100 clergy, monks and nuns were murdered in connection with the church valuables campaign. Another 165 priests were executed after 1923.